So, you just saw my last video on World War I, and now you're wondering what happened next. So here we go. The interwar period was crazy worldwide. It started with an influenza pandemic killing about 50 million people worldwide. When the Allied powers won World War I, they totally redrew the map. The three Central Empires, the Ottomans, Austrians, and Germans, were dismantled. The Ottoman lands were mostly split between England and France, including what would become Israel, and the empire became the country of Turkey, which would rise to prominence under war hero Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Austria got split into a bunch of different areas, including Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, while Serbia, one of the allies, expanded to become Yugoslavia with neighboring Balkan states. Germany probably was punished the worst with the Treaty of Versailles. This took away Germany's foreign colonies, forced them to pay immense sums of money to France, made them shrink their military, imposed a war guilt clause that made them take responsibility for the war, and changed the country's borders, giving some land to France and some to the restored country of Poland. Within Germany, two rival governments tried to take power, one socialist and one more moderate, with the latter, Weimar Republic, eventually winning the German Revolution. But while things were messy in Germany, the Allies tried to create a union of governments called the League of Nations. Thought up by American President Woodrow Wilson, the body helped to manage interstate conflict and prevent another war. However, the American people wanted to return to isolationism, so they never joined despite Wilson's pleas. As such, the League had very little power. And despite being an ally in the war, Russia wasn't part of the League either. They had left the war early, and in November of 1917, the Bolsheviks had tried to take over the empire, starting a massive civil war. Here, whites fought the communist Reds, and many other nations tried to gain independence. Through 1919 and 21, Poland and the Soviets fought a war in which the Bolsheviks tried to take over Poland and spread communism all the way to Germany, but they were stopped at the Battle of Warsaw and turned back. Eventually, in 1922, the Red Bolsheviks won their bloody civil war and established the USSR, the world's first communist state. Over in Italy, the fascists came to power under Mussolini that same year, introducing both far-right and far-left governments in Europe. Meanwhile, in Germany, political tensions were rising. The Weimar government, despite being a democracy that was actually quite progressive, was struggling. Germany was struggling to pay its debts, and many people were angry at France, leading to a rise in right-wing nationalist groups. These right-wing groups, like the Freikorps, often clashed with left-wing communists, while the centrist government tried to keep them at bay. In this chaos, a man named Adolf Hitler began to rise, attempting to take power in a putsch in 1923 before going to jail and writing his famous book, Mein Kampf. Back in America, things were going really well, and an era known as the Roaring Twenties was taking place. There was a renaissance in music and art and consumer culture, and the prohibition of alcohol created a massive gang network in the country. Plus, the economy was doing really well, but that would change in 1929. The US stock market crashed, starting the Great Depression. This not only affected the US, which saw a major cultural shift during this time, but also harmed the rest of the world. By now, everything was going downhill. In China, another communist movement led by Mao Zedong emerged in 1927, starting a long civil war that wouldn't be settled until the 50s. In Germany, hyperinflation had already decimated the already struggling economy, and the Depression only made it worse. Radical groups became even more popular. By 1933, the once imprisoned Hitler rose to power, quickly declaring a dictatorship and implementing Nazi policies. In the USSR, Stalin had come to power and began to reform the Soviet Union through terror and communist economics. In the early 1930s, he implemented a 5-year plan which took food from the rural areas, especially Ukraine, and in the process killed millions of Ukrainians while putting millions more people into the Gulag labor camps. In the Middle East, England allowed many Jews to immigrate to Palestine, but they clashed with the native Arabs through the 20s and 30s, and many violent riots and massacres would take place. In the US, things weren't quite as bad, and President Roosevelt introduced the New Deal, a series of economic programs that tried to help Americans through the Depression. By the end of the 30s, it seemed like war was once again on the horizon. In 1935, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, restarting colonial expansion. In 1936, fascists tried to take over Spain with Germany's help, which started another fascist dictatorship in Europe. In 1937, Japan expanded its military and invaded China, forcing the divided country to unify against the new threat. The Japanese would commit terrible atrocities in China, especially Nanjing, and millions would die. In Europe, Germany was also remilitarizing, persecuting Jews, and expanding the German realm. At first, this expansion was peaceful, and the Allies let him do it, especially the UK and its Prime Minister Chamberlain. But Hitler took more than he said he wanted as he annexed Czechoslovakia. The interwar period was extremely chaotic. Germany, Japan, Italy, Spain, and Russia all became violent dictatorships, while war broke out all over the place. The Allies' attempt to improve the world with the League of Nations had failed. America saw a massive rise and then economic collapse, which accelerated this global decline, and by 1939, the world was on the brink of a new world war.